All right, welcome. Welcome to the best AGS event of 2025 so far. So we're starting a new calendar year, and I couldn't think of a better way to start it than with my friend Karlin, who's also one of the leading defense intellectuals in America. And so she has a lot to say, but before I let her say it, I want to let you know about some things that are coming down the pike. We've announced the Phillips lecture, which is going to be Secretary Pompeo, and the registration for that is a little complicated. The registration window closes a full week before, so that's set February 10th, but the window for it closes on the 3rd because we have to run all the names past because of the Iranians. Please, if you want to come to that, you have to sign up in advance, and you'll need a DukeNet ID for that. Also, before then, on the 3rd, Tanvi Madan is coming. She's a great
That's awesome.
Expert on South Asia. She's at Brookings, and that you don't have to sign up so far in advance for, but that will be just as interesting. And then on the what is it, the 6th? What's the date? Yes, the 6th. A special event for students who are interested in internships and working in DC and opportunities like that. That's a special opportunity for you, and I encourage you to come to that. And actually, that's a great segue. How did you get started in DC? Did you start at with an internship? Tell us how you got started.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it is such a treat to be here. Thank you all so much for having me. I have to say, I am so jealous that y'all get to learn from Peter Feaver. His brain.
They're over it. They are way over
it. Don't be over it. It is amazing how often I find myself quoting his really good scholarship. So you all no doubt know how lucky you are, but for those of us who haven't had that experience, what a fantastic thing. So look, I can tell you this really beautiful narrative of how I ended up doing the things I've done and how I ended up here. I just need y'all to know that the narrative's kind of made up. Okay, and that at these various moments in my career, there are these sort of twists and turns that happen where you make a choice and then some other serendipitous event happens, and the next thing you know, you're doing something else. So I just want to make that very clear. Like, if you had said to me when I was in college, hey, you're going to move to DC and go work for the Department of Defense and go work for 6 secretaries of defense, et cetera, that would have literally made no sense to me. So how did I kind of end up doing the things that I've been doing? I grew up in Wisconsin. Do we have any Midwesterners here? Awesome. Wisconsin, any cheeseheads? Yeah, okay. That totally works. We won't talk about last night.
How'd that work? Yeah.
Turns out not well. So I grew up in Wisconsin, and that meant I never met anyone who served in the US military. My only real understanding of the government was that Congress. I didn't realize you could go work in government. Frankly, then I went to college in Louisiana, and I went and did a study abroad year. And this study abroad year just sort of blew my brain open. I spent a lot of time traveling across Europe, Asia, and Africa. And in particular, I spent a chunk of time in the Middle East. This is meaningful because it gets me on this path. So I was living in the Middle East during the height of the peace process. I know this feels very long ago, and now I seem very old. But this was a moment in time where a whole bunch of folks around the Middle East thought that peace was about to break out. So I was sitting in my classes kind of studying this and learning this and fascinated by, this sort of butterflies and unicorns vision of the Middle East. And then I came home for my last year of college, and it turned out everyone was wrong. And in fact, the Middle East erupted into spectacular conflict yet again. I couldn't figure out why that was, right? Why were all these folks calling this wrong across the region? What was really happening? So like any good political science major, I was supposed to go to law school, right? That's what you do. I told my parents, I'm going to go to Washington for 1 year because I want to try to understand what's happening in the Middle East and Middle East policy. I thought Washington would be a place to do it. And then, of course, I will go to law school. So the spoiler alert is 2.5 decades later, I never made it to law school and I never left Washington. So as I'm in Washington, I start to realize that actually much of kind of the dilemmas within international relations in the Middle East, my region of interest, really meant you had to think about security and defense issues. You had to try to understand defense policy as a way to try to shape that region and others. And so I started with an internship in the Department of Defense. I worked in what's known as the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which I realize sounds like you sit in a little office just like next to the SecDef. It turns out, no, there's many thousands of people who work there. And I thought this was just downright fascinating. I was working for Secretary Rumsfeld at the time. This was in the years not long after the September 11th attacks. And there were all these huge policy dilemmas, right? What did it look like for the US military to be involved in the Middle East? What role did the US military have more globally? And I appreciated that so many of these policy dilemmas didn't have a clear-cut answer, right? And in fact, many of the options were pretty tough and just like riddled with cons and opportunity costs. Nevertheless, I had found my place. I went to grad school, and then I've gone in and out of the Pentagon ever since. So I was in the Bush administration as a civil servant, a career civil servant. That means you're there no matter who's in power. I was in the Obama administration, a political appointee, and in the Biden administration as a political appointee. That means that you're there serving at the pleasure of the president. I joke that means you've signed up to be unemployed someday. And I've served in a wide variety of roles. My last role was designing and then implementing the National Defense Strategy, which is effectively how do you figure out your strategy for the US military and then smartly spend $850 billion. So a long way of saying there's a beautiful narrative that hopefully I've just spun for you, but there's all sorts of twists and turns that happen.
Let me ask you a couple questions that arise from that. First is the transition from civil servant to political appointee. One of the things that seems to be on the table now is an incoming administration that views all civil servants as political appointees. So talk a little bit about that tension and what caused you to say, okay, no, I don't want to be a civil servant. I want to be a political appointee.
Yeah, absolutely. The US government is a pretty extraordinary thing, I have to say. When you look at the services that the US government delivers for all of us, and having spent a lot of time inside government, I can tell you just about everyone is there, not for the money, not for the prestige, but because we got this sort of feeling in our belly that we want to be public servants, right? We want to do good somehow. And when you can do that through the apparatus of the US government, it's incredibly powerful. I have found the civil service to be tremendously professional, and I've seen that across a number of different administrations, a number of different secretaries of defense. You know, their job is to be that institutional knowledge, to be able to tell you, all right, we've seen this problem before. Here are the different ways we can deal with it. Here are the pros. Here are the cons. Here's what's worked in the past. And then when the decision is made, they say, all right, let's go make that a reality. I think it's really unfortunate when folks have this kind of negative tinge or vilify the public service because, again, the overwhelming majority of folks, they're there because they are trying to do good with the resources at their disposal. For me personally, I had started as a career civil servant and spent about 5 years or so in the Bush administration in that role, covering Middle East policy and South Asia policy. I left then to do my doctorate because I was getting old and I figured if it was ever going to happen, it had to finally occur. And I made the decision to come back in a political role because, frankly, I didn't quite see myself as spending, 3-4 decades straight in government. I like the idea of coming in and out. When I'm being out, trying to kind of get smart on topics, interrogate what I had worked on, what went well, what didn't go well. And I also really believed in the vision of the presidents that I worked for as an appointee. I do believe, as I suspect some folks here are debating if they want to become an appointee at some point in your career. I would say I do think you have to largely align yourself with the vision of the folks in power. Not 100%, that's never going to happen, but about the 70% or so level, and in particular on the issues on which you're working. I think that's sort of the most appropriate tack to take.
Well, let me clarify. You're saying that's to be a political appointee. Just in case they missed it, you served in the Defense Department when we invaded Iraq. You were working on Middle East policy.
Yes.
So
I got there just after Iraq, actually. Yes.
Oh, okay. So you avoided that, but still, you were.
No. But
how can you live with yourself? Is the question. No, and the reason I'm asking it is because I've had a number of students say, "Well, I'd like to go I'm graduating, and in the 4 years that I'm graduating, it's going to be, say, a Trump administration. They may, so talk about the civil servant in an administration that you may not have supported a major part of their policy.
So my first full-time job in the Pentagon was advising the Secretary of Defense on U.S. policy towards India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh. So Pakistan post 9/11, you all might know our approach there is to effectively pay Pakistan a lot of money so that their military can go deal with bad actors to make it easier on the U.S. military in Afghanistan. I wasn't terribly smart on South Asia issues. I had a Middle East background, but was working on getting smart. And after not too long, I was thinking, this doesn't make any sense. In fact, it seems as though we are trying hard to pay Pakistan a lot of money for its military to go deal with problems so that the U.S. military doesn't have to. But in many ways, they're doing the exact opposite, right? They're fomenting bad actors. They're not validating that they're using, U.S. resources appropriately. And it didn't make sense to me. So as a career civil servant, what that meant is that I was responsible for regularly telling the Secretary of Defense, here's what our policy is, here's what we're trying to do, and here are my concerns with it. Here's why I think that's not working quite well. Here are the pros and cons of this approach. Now, frankly, it took a number of years for the U.S. government to really realize, I think, and internalize that the Pakistani government was not actually doing the steps that we wanted them to do in making things easier in Afghanistan. But my role was to help the Secretary of Defense understand all of the dilemmas inherent in what he was trying to do.
And so how does that interact with, say, the Iraq War, but more sort of the moral quandary of working in an administration where you might not have a 70% alignment with them? That's the question.
Absolutely. As your career civil servant, you absolutely might not have 70% alignment. You might have 10% alignment. But your job is to be there in a responsible way on behalf of the American public and help folks understand the potential consequences of their decisions. And then when they make those decisions, you go with them. And if you feel so very strongly, then you decide either to work a different issue set or to no longer serve in that role.
Okay. I'm going to now fast forward to your most recent job in the administration, in the Biden administration, working on the national defense strategy. The reason is our last speaker of the last semester was Bridge Colby, who told us, sitting right here, I think, he said, we wrote a great national defense strategy, and that was available for the incoming Biden administration just to build on. So you come in. How do you assess the national defense strategy you inherited? And what were the things that you said we got to change or expand on on your watch?
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll probably know this, but Congress gives the Department of Defense a homework assignment. Every 4 years, you have to say, what's your strategy? And ideally, that strategy is then going to inform how you're going to spend, hundreds of billions of dollars, right? It's kind of going to be your North Star, as Secretary Austin likes to talk about it. What's interesting is Congress also ends up having a National Defense Strategy Commission, which is a group of outside folks whose job it is every 4 years to say, hey, how is that strategy? So effectively, Congress is grading your homework, and then they've got another group of smart folks who are grading your homework as well, if that makes sense. So after the 2018 defense strategy came out, I worked on the Congressional Commission to assess it. And what we found was the big challenge was that civilian voices had really been muted in the implementation of that strategy. And in fact, while some of the ideas in the 2018 strategy were worthwhile, like, hey, we really got to focus on China, Russia's really important, I can agree with that, the implementation really hadn't been terribly worthwhile whatsoever. So fast forward to the 2022 National Defense Strategy. So we were working on that for about, say, 6 months or so before it got published internally in a classified document. And then a couple months later, it gets published externally unclassified, which means you can Google it and you can read the National Defense Strategy and have all sorts of thoughts on it, right? So it's got the unclassified version obviously has a number of different audiences. I would suggest that this National Defense Strategy is the punchiest and pithiest and most focused on prioritization of any defense strategy to come out of the Department of Defense. There is no doubt what it's focused on. It says the focus is on China, period, full stop. the urgent need to sustain and strengthen deterrence vis-a-vis China. Yes, you have to worry about other challenges, Iran, violent extremists, North Korea, Russia, but no kidding, you have to focus on that. But in particular, what I had learned from being in and out of the Defense Department so often, that there's a lot of smart strategies and they sit on shelves. They never actually become realized. And so what I had focused a lot on, and Secretary of Defense Austin is the reason this became a reality, was how to implement it. Not just pulling together a smart strategy, but making it a reality. So we built a very intense, very time-consuming 360-degree approach to ensure that this strategy would become a reality, that every senior leader would regularly have to report to the Secretary of Defense, here's what I'm doing to make this strategy real. And if I'm not doing it, you're going to call me on that. And that, I think, is part of the secret sauce. Look, we can't all help but get excited about writing brilliant things, right? I mean, we're all students in some way. That's what, really tickles us. But at the end of the day, if you can't make your ideas a reality, they're not terribly worthwhile.
So what we had Colin Call here last year. He likewise said it was one of the best strategies that had ever been written. He was your boss in DoD. And we pushed him on what integrated deterrence meant. So this is one of the buzzwords that comes out of your strategy. Explain it for this audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So this 2022 strategy is really focused on deterrence, right? Deterrence being, don't do that thing. I want to make it very clear. And in particular, I hate China. Don't do that thing, but I'm going to apply it to a number of different actors. So this term integrated deterrence becomes hot. What does it mean? Let's take the words kind of separately, integrated and deterrence. Who am I integrating? I'm integrating across the Department of Defense, across the US government, and with allies and partners. Effectively just means we've all got to be on the same page, right? So if you're one part of the Department of Defense and you're another part and y'all are working at cross purposes, that's not terribly useful. Or if you're the State Department and you're the White House and y'all are doing something different, or you're one close Asian ally, you're one close European ally, and y'all are working cross purposes, like that's not going to work well. So that's the integration piece, tying together across these three communities. Then there's the deterrence piece, right? Really showing that we have certain things we do not want to happen, and we're communicating that to certain actors. So saying to countries, don't try to take this other country. If you do, we're going to make it incredibly painful to you. And in fact, we're also going to build such resilience so that if you try to respond or do something, it's going to bounce off of us and we'll be able to respond at a time and a place of our choosing. So that's kind of the concept.
Okay. And it sounds good on paper. But while you all were writing that, the Biden administration was actually implementing a policy, the Afghan withdrawal. How did the whole of government integration of execution on the Afghan withdrawal sort of map onto or show the ability of the administration to do this kind of integrated activity?
Absolutely. And in fact, I might rewind your question even more. Throughout the post 9/11 wars, this term whole of government got really hot, right? You all probably heard this term. And when I was doing interviews for my last book on the legacies of the 9/11 wars, I remember one person I was interviewing who kept talking about the whole of government, HOLE. You can imagine they didn't feel terribly confident about how well the government could knit together. And I get that. There were a number of examples in the post 9/11 wars where that was absolutely the case. The interesting kind of tension with the Afghanistan withdrawal, of course, is that if you are focused on the security piece, your job is to get out of Afghanistan as fast as you can, right? And in fact, even though the deadline for the US military withdrawal was about September or so, 01, the US military by that summer was already almost out because there's nothing like a group of overachievers as the US military. The tension here, however, is if you're also simultaneously trying to show support for the Afghan government, then in fact, you don't want to race out, right? You want to be able to show that you're supporting them, that you want them to be able to continue to govern and to, for them to be able to offer security, et cetera. So I think you really saw that profound tension clash in a quite spectacular way in July and then August 2021, where the folks really focused on defense and security are saying we have to get out as fast as possible to keep the troops safe, incredibly important. the folks say from the State Department, the folks looking at diplomacy are effectively saying, no, what we need to do is show that we're still supporting that government in Kabul. And as that government in Kabul starts to crumble within a few days, then the defense and security piece has to really take over. If I might give a different case study, though, I would look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which in my mind really stands out as a fantastic example of integrated deterrence at work. Now, look, the Biden administration was a little bit spoiled, right? We had Russia's playbook, so we knew that they were going to do this invasion for months and months before they did so. So much so that we were able to think about our policies and approaches. We were able to talk to our allies and partners as well. We also were able to try to push the Russians and tell them it would be a terrible idea. I think they were going to do it almost no matter what. I think short of sending the U.S. military to Ukraine, which for understandable reasons was not a decision made by President Biden, they were going to go and do this invasion. But what you saw right as that invasion was hitting was a coordinated response across the U.S. government to race assistance to Ukraine and its military. You saw a number of countries, it's up to 50 plus countries, start to come together and say, we're going to support Ukraine and Ukraine's military, and messaging to make it very clear that there was going to be this continued assistance. We're sitting here 2.5 years later. Frankly, Ukraine still exists because of the tremendous bravery of the Ukrainian people and very much because of that integrated approach across the U.S. government and its allies and partners.
Okay, let me push back a little bit. Even though I support the administration's policy on Ukraine, it seems odd to me to call that a success of deterrence. We didn't deter Russia from invading. I accept that we couldn't deter them. But we also, they're still fighting. So what have we deterred them from doing? What is the thing that the successful deterrence was achieved?
Absolutely. Ukraine's existence as a country, right? Russia right now owns about 20% of Ukraine. That's really bad. It's also not 100% of Ukraine, right? We made it hard enough for them to do so. The Russians themselves have put certain constraints on their effort to take Ukraine. I mean, there have been moments in time over the last few years that I'm sure you all will recall where Russia has made these threats from like using nuclear weapons, for instance. Those kind of threats have been deterred. But nevertheless, Putin is going to keep going, right? This is what he terms to be in his national security interests and will continue pushing.
Okay, another club that you're a member of, this is the coolest club of all. You're a member of the Civ Mill Nerd Club, a very tiny elite
you're the
group.
godfather of the club.
So there's a very tiny number of group, and I think maybe the day or something before you went into government, you published a book that made a number of important arguments. One of them was that Civ Mill was in crisis. This is in 2021. And so talk a little bit, what was it like to have told a building, you're in crisis and now I'm here to help? So why was it in crisis? And is it still in crisis and, now 4 years later?
Yeah, absolutely. So this book that I wrote, The Inheritance, America's Military After 2 Decades of War, is trying to examine what are the legacies of the post 9/11 wars, right? The U.S. military was at war for the longest period of time in its contemporary history. What comes out of that, right? What does it look like? There's a number of things that I argue the military's inherited, and in particular, there's a handful of crises under the civil-military relations kind of rubric that I find most concerning. So I'm concerned about a crisis of confidence within the U.S. military, where effectively folks aren't exactly sure, what have I been fighting for? What have the results of that been, right? What's been worthwhile here, right? What have I achieved? There's a crisis of caring where effectively the military looks at the American public and says, do you actually care? Are you actually interested? Because we've seen profound public disinterest in the post 9/11 wars and pretty hollow but broad support, although that support is falling as well over the last few years. And then this crisis of meaningful civilian control, which is effectively a real degradation in the ability and the efficacy of civilians trying to make decisions on and shape military efforts in these post 9/11 wars. So the Pentagon that I walked into at the very beginning of the Biden administration, I think very much was in crisis on that last piece. A number of processes had fallen into disarray. I mean, this is an entity, an institution of 3 million people and $850 billion. If you don't have good process, I don't know how you're getting anything done. There was a total lack of collaboration between those in uniform and those out of uniform, including at the most senior levels. And frankly, the oxygen was stale at best. And so one of the big areas of focus for Secretary of Defense Austin and his close partner, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, was to make sure that we were repairing all of these civil-military relations and actually reestablishing healthy civil-military relations. And by doing, the way you do that is you get folks communicating again. You get folks sharing information again, increasing transparency, collaborating, being able to say, here's how I understand the situation. Here's how you understand the situation. Here are the pros and cons. Now let's go forward and staff folks and treat folks respectfully. I mean, frankly, that's the only way that you can deal with the very hard policy dilemmas that are ahead of all of us, right? Look at the security environment. Nothing terribly easy ahead of any of us, right? You've got to find a way to work together and do that. And instead, because folks had gotten so divided, the air had gotten so toxic, effectively, you had a number of senior civilians who weren't doing the job that they had been confirmed by the US Senate to do in a responsible way, and a number of staff who weren't actually staffing them to be able to understand what are the options ahead of me and what do I go do?
Well, in about 12 hours or so, no, not 12, but within 24 hours,
Yep.
Pete Hegseth is going to be facing a confirmation hearing. And he wrote a book right before he got nominated to be Secretary of Defense that said, more or less, the Defense Department is in crisis, that the Biden administration has broken the Defense Department, and the next administration is going to need to completely repair the DOD for all of the reasons. So without going point by point through his book, you've heard the critique. What are those on the outside now who will be coming perhaps to lead the organization? What was their critique that you thought, they're way off here? And was there any part of their critique where you said, well, they got a point there? So
it seems to me that Hegseth's big argument is a culture argument, right? His belief is that the military and the senior military leaders have all been sort of captured by issues involving like diversity, for instance, and have sort of taken what he and others have termed like this woke approach to how to be effective. And the thing is, that doesn't really resonate with me. First of all, the secret sauce of America's military is its people, right? The fact that you have people from a wide variety of backgrounds who can go anywhere at any time and be tremendously effective. A whole lot of countries, including China, for example, have a lot of capabilities, a lot of platforms similar to what our military has. What they don't have is that secret sauce of the American workforce, that innovative kind of folks who are serving in uniform. So it seems to me when we are more represented, we're kind of stronger together. What worries me in particular, though, is his approach that those who serve in uniform need to really be empowered to do whatever they want. That's actually not what our system is, right? We have a system of civilian control, a system of civilian oversight. If you all are familiar with Hegseth's bio, one of the things that he's done is really push forward folks accused of war crimes, including by their kind of peers. And he's tried to say, no, they were doing what they needed to do. I worry about him pushing on those what could be ethical dilemmas and making our force a very different type of thing. Gosh, is there anything that I would agree with him on?
what about the recruiting crisis? He does flag a recruiting crisis.
There's something there. The recruiting crisis is a pretty interesting one. Over the last few years, so 2018 onward, public support for the U.S. military has gone down about 20% or so. Now, public support for most government institutions isn't terribly high, But the military was always like anomalously high. So the fact that there's this change, I think, should trigger a question in all of our brains. We've then seen this recruiting crisis over the last
Maybe
year.
even produce a book or something.
I mean, perhaps one could write a book about it. I don't know. I can't imagine who would. Again, you should read everything Peter Feaver has written. If you haven't, you will be worse off for it. So recruiting crisis, there's probably a number of different variables that are playing into it. Now, some folks will say it's the economy. Some folks will say, COVID made it really hard to like get into the high schools and get folks inspired. I actually think a piece of it, though, is this crisis of caring. I think a piece of it is that it is very easy to be an American citizen and to have never met or interacted with someone in the U.S. military, to have no idea what it means to be able to serve and to not even know how to begin that kind of conversation, right? I remember reading a study a couple of years back about how when the public doesn't know how to begin conversations with folks in uniform, they'll go to issues like post-traumatic stress or sexual assault. Obviously, those are not the ways to start a good conversation, right? And so you've got this real gap, right? Again, Peter has written a lot about this gap. And I think that gap has really come to the fore as we've seen distrust in institutions only get louder and louder. And that, I have to assume, has played into recruitment. Now, look, the recruitment numbers look better for certain parts of the military. So the Marine Corps is an interesting one. They, as far as I've seen over the last few years, have been pretty solid. That's probably not least. Do we have some Marines here, it looks like? Anyone? Or maybe potential Marines?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. All right. So part of this is probably the Marine Corps has a very strong.
They'll take anyone, is what you're saying.
The identity, right? The identity is strong, right? The Marines know who they are. They know what they're doing. Because they're so small, they're able to build a community in a way that's just a lot harder, frankly, for many of the other services. We've seen this, I think, probably most profoundly with the U.S. Army. It has now met its recruitment goals over the last year, although those numbers, I think, were perhaps adjusted a little bit, but it met them. That seems to be really interesting. Let me just end on one point here, though, which is retention is pretty high. So that's intriguing. It means that it can be tough to get folks to know what it looks like serving the military and to join. But once folks start joining, they want to stay. They like what they are seeing. And that tells me there's something really positive happening within this institution. And my fear is someone like Hegseth seems to be quite anti-institutionalist. And so as you turn a massive institution upside down, how do you make sure we keep a lot of the goodness?
So I want to push on that just a little further. In case they missed it, your critique of the Trump administration was critiquing people who were running the Defense Department who had a lot of experience. Four-star general, Secretary Mattis had a lot of experience in defense. Secretary Esper, likewise, significant experience. And yet you said there was flaws that you saw in what they were doing. Does that mean that someone who comes from the outside, like Hegseth, would have a chance to now a fresh look and completely do things? Maybe we've tried experienced people, let's try inexperienced people. Is that the argument, or you're worried that it will be worse?
I worry a lot will be worse. First of all, I have difficulty thinking of the last time we've had a Secretary of Defense who has not touched strategic national security issues. So we've had senators as secretaries of defense. We've had retired generals, of course, as secretaries of defense. We've had former White House chief of staff. We've had folks from a number of different backgrounds, folks who've served in the Defense Department at various levels, but folks who've all had to wrestle with these big dilemmas. How do I understand the future security environment? How do I plan to make sure the U.S. military is successful if it has to wage war in the future? All of these kinds of things they've had to think about and wrestle with at the strategic level. I worry a lot about someone doing that for the very first time when they are sitting in the E-ring looking out at Arlington National Cemetery. I don't know how one can be effective doing that.
And let me ask you the favorite DC parlor game of the Doge. This seems to double down on the argument that what we need is fresh thinking. Mm-hmm. And you've been in the Defense Department enough to know that there's a lot of things that aren't working well.
Absolutely.
So maybe an outside group like Doge that can tap some of our most innovative entrepreneurs, maybe that's going to produce some positive ideas. Tell me how you, from an inside DoD perspective, what that kind of thing might look like.
Absolutely. So I'm all for fresh ideas by super smart people. Let me digress with a quick story. A bit ago, I was asked to brief someone very senior from the Silicon Valley world about the defense kind of policymaking process, how we do strategy and budgets. And when I explained to them, they said, "Oh, got it. You know, I think the first thing you need to do is you got to get Congress out of the budget piece." And I said, "Well, that is a really creative thought. It turns out it's very inconvenient. Our system doesn't, in fact, allow that. You all no doubt know Congress has the power of the purse. So as much as I might like to be queen for a day and say, here's exactly what that defense budget's going to look like, that's literally not how our democracy is designed. So I'm excited for the fresh ideas. Frankly, there are reforms that need to happen in the Department of Defense. Absolutely. The challenge is a couple-fold. One, reforms involve taking risk. And oftentimes folks are terrified because the last folks you want to get it wrong are the folks who are responsible for protecting you and your family. Two, reforms involve making, we need efficiencies, right? We need to make some cuts in our defense budget in key areas, probably, and grow in others. Well, turns out people are among our priciest assets. Now, I've told you our people are our secret sauce, right? We got to get the most talented folks. But people are expensive, and you could probably see arguments for making cuts to people. It's very hard to imagine Congress being enthusiastic about cutting the troops' numbers, cutting the troops' salary, cutting the troops' benefits. Three, there are legacy systems that the U.S. military doesn't need anymore, right? You've got more sophisticated systems, more modernized systems, and platforms that you could use to deal with X or Y problem. The challenge is these are all made in someone's district. It can be very hard to get members of Congress to say, I'm okay getting rid of those jobs in my district and increasing unemployment. So effectively, there's just a handful of these challenges that while I think reforms would be exactly right, it's a complicated and entrenched process, right? It's hard to do. Our democracy is designed to constrain action. That can be really, really frustrating, especially when one wants to try to shape-shift things like the defense budget. All that said, I'm excited to see what they pitch.
Okay, recently you published an important article in Foreign Affairs called Total War. What's the exact title of it?
Something along those lines.
Total
War, it's really bad.
Yes, you're against it, right? Yeah. But in so doing, I thought, boy, is she going out on a limb and predicting what the next war is going to be like? And if so, doesn't she remember telling me that no one has predicted what the next war looks like? So this is a very dangerous exercise. So make the case for why we need to read your article and how that will improve us and not get us trapped in a paradigm that then we'll be surprised by.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, we had the post 9/11 wars, right? Where the US military was really focused on fighting insurgents and terrorists. Now fast forward, and we've seen wars in the Middle East, we've seen war in Europe, and we've seen major challenges to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific over the last few years. So it seemed to me, these laboratories, we probably want to learn from, right? We want to try to figure out how and what ways is war changing so that we can be a little bit ahead of the game. And there are a couple things that jumped out at me. One is, as much as there have been these periods of time where I really want to focus on one type of war, so when I'm fighting terrorists and insurgents, I want to focus on that. Wait, I want to focus on what it looks like to deal with high-end conventional conflict. Nope, need to think about nuclear conflict. One of the lessons of the last few years is that continuum, you're just running across the whole thing. You actually have to be thinking about each piece on that continuum, right? I think that has been very loud, particularly as we look at Russia's war on Ukraine. Next thing that jumped out at me was the demographics of who was fighting on the battlefield. And when I look at the wars that we're seeing across the Middle East, those demographics are pretty interesting. We have state militaries. We have a wide variety of violent non-state actors. Some of those listen to their patrons. Some of those don't listen so much to their patrons. So that seems to really tell us that we've got to recognize that different folks are shaping a battlefield, both those on it and, of course, those outside of it as well. Another piece that jumped out at me looking at these kind of three regions in particular, was just how deterrence was changing and how we needed to look hard at what partners can you have on your team to help make deterrence more effective? How can you communicate efforts to deter more effectively? So really building a baseline on what's going to deter an adversary, and then figuring out through feedback loops what's actually shaping them, and recognizing that a little bit of uncertainty is actually not a terrible thing, but you don't want too much uncertainty. So while I definitely am not guessing exactly what the future security environment is going to look like, what I have seen from these conflicts or potential conflicts is that we've got to really recognize that this security environment is changing in some meaningful ways, and we've got to thus make changes with our approach.
Okay, I'm going to ask my last question, and while you're answering it, Zach has got the mic, and I'll recognize hands for questions from the audience. You already said what the incoming team is worrying about that they shouldn't worry about, woke military. They shouldn't worry so much about that. What are they not worrying about that you think they should really be worrying more about? What is scaring you that you think should scare the incoming administration and terrify the good people in this room as well? A problem that they need to focus on.
Absolutely. So the war in Ukraine, we've heard the president-elect say is going to end within 24 hours or so once he takes over. And you've also seen a very big push to get a ceasefire on at least the Israel-Hamas piece of the wars in the Middle East. What I think they need to think really hard about is what is expected of the United States as conflict in Europe and conflicts in the Middle East start to wrap up throughout 2025. What will folks expect from the United States and the U.S. military? Will they expect things like security guarantees, say for Ukraine? Will they expect things like the United States playing a role to lead efforts to rebuild the Palestinian Authority Security Service? What will they expect folks to be monitoring ceasefires in some sort of way? If you followed the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire that was put in place not long ago, what's different about that compared to the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war and the way that ended is now the U.S. is playing a role in monitoring that ceasefire. There will be violations of this ceasefire by both sides. Zero doubt about that. That I feel very confident predicting. What is it the United States is willing to do under those circumstances? So effectively, as conflicts start to wrap up, what is the mandate and the mission for the U.S. military, particularly in those two key regions?
Actually, you've just made, so who's got the first question? But before she goes, you just made me think of one more that I want to ask. Another DC parlor game. What is the briefing that when the president hears it, his head is going to explode? Meaning something that is going on that he may not realize is going on, and then when he hears it, and you just flagged the one that is my candidate for that, which is when he learns how much effort we're expending patrolling against the Houthi threat.
Yes.
He learns that that's mostly for the sea lanes of communication for Europe and Asia, not for the United States. His head is going to explode. Is there another thing like that when the administration finds out, they're going to, I mean, not the administration because the experts know this, but when the president discovers this?
Well, so that's a good point. I will just say on the Houthi effort, it's been more than $1 billion for the U.S. Navy to try to protect that waterway over the last year and a half. And it's been largely closed to maritime traffic, which is wild when you think about it. I mean, if you look at a map, that's a little bit mind-blowing. So what is the briefing that will sort of throw them awry? This has been written about a little. I personally am surprised by how little attention it has gotten. But it has, I would say the thing that should really disturb folks is that over the last 3 years, we have been closer to the use of nuclear weapons than at any point in my lifetime. That should be terrifying. And there have been moments where it's been reported on. Those have been brief. And then, frankly, there's been a lot of criticism of the Biden administration for being too slow to give Ukraine X or Y platform. And, folks have said the Biden administration has been kind of too nervous about these threats. But, when I was in grad school, folks weren't really interested in nuclear weapons, to be honest. Over the last decade and a half of teaching, I often found my students would get like a little sleepy when we would study nuclear weapons. If you are taking a class involving nuclear weapons, that is 100% worth your time right now, because they are ever more relevant.
Good time to do a staff ride of Hiroshima is what you're saying?
Perfect time to do that staff ride.
And speaking of which, Abigail, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming tonight. My question is, what do you think the 2026 NDS is going to look like? I'm assuming there's still a prioritization of China, but I'm wondering what else, given everything that's happened in the past couple of years, what else you think the NDS might hold?
Absolutely. So there's sort of two dilemmas when you're doing this strategy. One is, how clearly are you going to say the priority? I mean, look, China still remains the only country that can fundamentally reshape the global security order, like period, full stop. But it still poses a threat unlike any other country. So one element is, how much am I focusing on that? Where I think the like interesting work will be for the 2026 NDS is twofold. One is, how do you balance what you're doing with those other threats? Because you cannot ignore them. And there are some folks, you mentioned Bridge Colby, he's a great case study, who've said, yeah, just ignore all those other things that are happening. Ignore Europe, ignore the Middle East. We really have to focus. The challenge is, of course, the United States is a global power. And the way that like international affairs works is we're all watching the same TV screen. So if, for example, you say, I have a red line and it involves something involving the Middle East, and then you don't do anything when that red line is crossed, folks in Asia are going to start saying, wait a sec. Does that mean you're not going to listen when it involves us, right? There is one TV screen we are all watching, and that's inconvenient sometimes, but it turns out that that's the case. So what are you going to do about those other challenges? I think that will be a really interesting dilemma for them. The other one is figuring out, what does it look like for a number of our adversaries to cooperate? And, we're seeing this, obviously, if you've been reading, 3,000 or so of the like 10, 12,000 North Korean troops have now suffered casualties in Ukraine. That's kind of astonishing, right? Obviously, Russia's getting support from Iran and technological support from China. You're starting to see this cooperation in particular of late among a number of kind of bad revisionist actors. There's ceilings to that cooperation. There are limits to that cooperation. What does that look like? Because they're not meaningful partnerships. They're probably causing their own problems. How best do we tackle that? But that was not happening 5 years ago. That was not even happening 3 years ago to the extent that it's happening now.
Hi, I was wondering what your thoughts are on, okay, well, when I wrote this, I said there's like a blurring line between civilian and military, but I think that's the wrong way to put it. Sort of like Mattis's appointment, he was actively serving when he was not SecDef, but when he was requested. He had to get that whole waiver thing filled out. And now Hegseth is talking about sort of diminishing the civilian oversight. What are your thoughts on like what that kind of buffer should be of the civilians backing it?
Yeah, so, the last few years have been pretty interesting because you had Secretary Mattis, who had stopped serving just a couple years before, and thus required a waiver because Congress says you need to have not served in the military for at least 7 years if you're going to be in this role. And then you have Secretary Austin, who also needed that waiver because he had retired just a few years before. And in fact, Congress has now changed the law to 10 years. I think that, they hope that will play a role. What's so fascinating here for, I think, civil military nerds is you have, in some ways, two folks who are exactly the same. They have spent their entire careers in uniform, and now they are thrust into this huge position of becoming like the manifestation of civilian control next to the president, right? The Secretary of Defense. And they do the jobs in very different ways. Now, partially because they have very different presidents that they're working for and different patterns of civil military relations. And part of it is because they're very different people. And so the idea that I think some of us sort of wondered, which is, gosh, if you have someone who is a general officer, served in the military for a couple decades, go on to be Secretary of Defense, they're going to do it in this way or that way. They'll follow the rules in this way, or they'll kind of pish-posh the process in that way. We have two different case studies. So just to take one very extreme example to differentiate them and to show why this is kind of a fun experiment, fun intellectual experiment, Secretary Mattis, as Secretary of Defense for a couple years, did 0 war plans reviews, right? Key requirement of the job, right? Key element of the job. Secretary Austin consistently did war plans reviews. So you see folks who are both trying to do the same job under different circumstances and different environments, and they're going to do it differently. Now you may say, gosh, that's really obvious. Why are you telling me that's interesting? It's interesting because we'd had a number of civilians serving in these jobs, right? And we've been able to differentiate ourselves. Of course, someone who served as White House Chief of Staff will do the job differently than someone who is a senator. Now we have 2 case studies to show us also those in uniform who've been in uniform will do it differently as well.
A lot of us thought that Secretary Austin is a great American, but Biden had access to really great civilians, including Michelle Flournoy and many others, Catholics he could have picked. And it would have been better for Civ Mill if he had picked a civilian. I've asked you this question when you were in government. Now I'm going to ask you when you're out of government. What do you think of that argument?
It really comes down to what the president wants, right? What are they looking to that Secretary of Defense for? And they've got to have someone that they have a good relationship with, who they can be honest with, and who feels like they can be honest with them, because they're dealing with the toughest issues involving life and death. I think so many of the names you just said would have been fantastic. I will say, look, I didn't know Secretary Austin before he became SecDef. I've probably now briefed him 1,000 times over the last few years. And I'll tell you, one of the amazing things about him is he has lived in like every single part of the Department of Defense, in the military departments, in the combatant commands, in the joint staff. And it was amazing to me how often, no matter what topic we were talking about, he had some real history on it and had seen that and was always open and willing to learn.
Great.
Dr. Karlin, my name is Grant, and I'm a senior here. I took AGS seminar last semester, and in that class we read Leslie Gelb's book on Vietnam. The irony was that the system worked was the title. And in that book, he says that there wasn't enough debate in government about whether or not Vietnam was a core, vital U.S. interest, and that there was a lot of just asserting that security is indivisible, and that the world, since the world is an interconnected whole, we have to take actions everywhere to kind of curb communism. But he asks the question, while the world is an interconnected whole, why can't there be actions taken in certain parts of the world to compensate for actions which are not taken elsewhere? Do you think this rigorous thinking is happening about Taiwan, about why or why not it might be vital to our national security? And are we just kind of asserting that and not realizing that, hey, maybe we can live without defending Taiwan?
I do think a lot of the rigorous thinking is happening. In fact, and I'm sure Peter's had these experiences as well. You know, oftentimes you're sitting in the White House Situation Room, and it's not for lack of discussion. It's so much discussion, you know, where folks really are. I mean, policy making, this is probably really obvious. Policy making is really hard. So it's quite rare that you get options that are butterflies and unicorns. You usually get options that are like terrible, awful, and catastrophic. And you have to choose among those as opposed to these butterflies, unicorns ones. And so if you're thinking about things like use of force and national security interests, I have found you can't help but get serious about it and help but really debate it. And the best sort of leaders that you will work for, hopefully, are going to force that on you and are going to ask you those seemingly simple but incredibly penetrating and painful questions. What's it worth? Why would we do this? And what does that look like? And then, frankly, keep asking those questions. It can be really easy to just get on a path and stay on that path. But you all have probably read Clausewitz at some point, right? You set these objectives and then you reassess those objectives. There are always options to say, no, I'm done with this. No, I'm actually going to go for more limited objectives. And we've seen time and time again throughout history where folks either got very excited and went for more grandiose objectives or actually just limited those as well.
Let me just piggyback on Grant's question, though, and ask it a second time where you can't wiggle out so easily.
I didn't wiggle out.
Grant's really asking, I think, maybe we're overweighting the importance of Taiwan independence.
Mm-hmm.
It obviously means a lot to China, and it might mean more to China than to the United States. And instead of saying we should really care about it, maybe we should take a hard-headed look and conclude we shouldn't care about it. Is that a fair way?
Yeah, I also just wanted to know your opinion on why we should consider defending Taiwan.
Absolutely. Yes. All right. I did not mean to wiggle out of that. Thank you for the push. Yes. So look, it can be very easy to fall into a domino theory trap, and your Vietnam example is a perfect case study. Now, the difference, of course, is we're not in the throes of a conflict with China over Taiwan. And in fact, y'all are probably familiar with US policy towards Taiwan. It's all like incredibly ambiguous for quite deliberate reasons. And yet simultaneously, you've got the Department of Defense giving kind of historic levels of assistance to Taiwan, trying to build Taiwan's military and do all sorts of things so as to try to deter China from ever making that call. I think that ambiguity is worth it because I think it is helpful for China to have to ask those questions. Will a great power get involved here? Fundamentally, it does seem to me that Taiwan is in US national security interests. And I say that not just because of what Taiwan is, but because of what it represents. You know, a decade ago, if we were sitting here, there would have probably been some debate. What is China trying to do? Hey, they're building some islands in the South China Sea. They're like poking the Japanese a little bit in the East China. Like, we're not exactly sure. What are they doing? What sort of approach do they really have to the international order? Fast forward a decade, no one's having that conversation anymore, right? Like there is zero debate about what China is trying to do in trying to overturn regional security in the Indo-Pacific, and I have to assume thus globally as well. And I'm just looking in the defense realm, but if you look at other things like how they've operated economically, diplomatically, et cetera, you'll see a number of ways in which they're saying, hey, we want a different system. It seems to me from US national security interests, this system actually works really well for us. This system is undergoing some changes to be sure, and that paradigm is shifting, but the Chinese vision is absolutely not in our interest. And Taiwan, I think, is seen as the epitome for kind of investing in that system, but not just by the Chinese, by a whole number of countries as well. This kind of gets at we're all watching the same TV for the international security environment. And I worry so much about the signals of what would happen were China to take Taiwan, the implications for a number of other conflicts around the world.
Haley.
Great. Thanks so much. I've got two questions, if you'll permit me, Peter. The first, your point about concern about nuclear weapons use threats sort of brought a question to my head, pairing that with the role of Russia in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So the question, given we should be concerned about the threat of nuclear weapon use, are the restrainers not correct then that we should do whatever we can do to end the war in Ukraine, given that Putin has threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons in the region? So are the restrainers right in this instance where if we are really concerned about nuclear weapons, why not do whatever we can to end the war in Ukraine? So that's sort of my substantive question. My second question is more related to your career. I was curious what you saw as the value added of getting a graduate degree and in your political.
Why get a PhD? That's
Yes, as a current postdoc, I'm curious about what you saw the value added of getting a doctorate and for some other folks, a master's degree, and how that served you in your political career.
Absolutely. So let me take that second one first. I mean, the master's degree was just, I mean, that's when I learned so much about this field. I studied poli-sci as an undergrad. I hadn't really appreciated the field of security or strategic studies whatsoever. So that was the first time it kind of all hit me. The PhD, while it definitely hasn't gotten me more money or a better job or tons of amazing new opportunities, I will say the PhD sort of took my brain and twisted and turned it upside down. And I find I am so much better at taking in a lot of information, finding patterns, and building frameworks. And that's all really important if you want to be a policymaker, right? You have way too much to read every day. You're dealing with major dilemmas, and you're trying to figure out, how do I understand this and what do I do about that? So the PhD, I think, was just gold for doing so. And I would like to think that the kind of things that I've written since doing a PhD are infused with so much more rigor because of that. On your first question, are the restrainers just right? Let's just have Russia take Ukraine and, wish them well.
because of the nukes.
Because of the nukes specifically. I mean, the challenge there is now nuclear weapons are a veto, right? And so if that's the case, look, they're terribly worthwhile. I have to assume that one of Beijing's great lessons learned from the last few years is that historic modernization and diversification they made in their nuclear arsenal was absolutely worth all of the money. But if that's getting them, if that's getting any country a veto, then you're effectively saying to them, please feel free to start taking other countries as well, right? So you can eat up Ukraine, maybe start eating up the Balts, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is absolutely not a security environment that we would want or that would be safer.
Last question, Mill.
Yeah, I want to go back to Pete Hegseth if I can. While I think a lot of people in this room agree with your critiques of him, the rank and file of the services don't, and overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump. What does it mean for the Department of Defense, in your experience, that there exists such a political chasm between the civilian staff of the DoD and the troops who serve in the military?
So I haven't seen the polling that shows that I don't know if this is officer corps enlisted that overwhelmingly supported the president-elect. I would buy it. I just haven't seen it. And sort of support his vision, not Hegseth per se, right? It seems to me that the reason President-elect Trump won is threefold. He won on the economy, he won on all things immigration, and he won on identity issues. Now, those largely aren't national security issues, but they're at least adjacent, particularly in terms of immigration, right, to national security. What it tells me is that those who are serving are concerned about those three issues and the approaches that have been taken on them, along with huge swaths of the American public as well. I would be very curious, though, to see polling on the military specifically and any surveys of why folks were going that route. There is, one hypothesis, there's traditionally a belief that Republicans will support higher defense budgets. Over the last few years, actually, the defense budget has gotten more and more robust. The biggest challenge, frankly, has been Congress, again, that whole power of the purse issue, and deals made with Congress over top lines. But that would probably be my best guess. Fundamentally, those who serve in the military are citizens like all of you. And so it would seem to me that those top issues in the brains of most citizens are probably in their brains on the whole as well.
Okay, it just remains for me to give you three thank yous. Thank you for your service to the country already inside government. Thank you for the service I know you're going to provide now that you're outside watching closely what's going on and informing us. And thank you for what you gave us today. We're very much in your debt.